Today we're going to talk about Chapter 15. Chapter 15 discusses the somatosensory nervous system and the somatomotor nervous system. The somatosensory nervous system is a complex system of sensory neurons and neural pathways that respond to changes at the surface of your skin or inside your body. The somatosensory nervous system begins at a receptor where a change has been detected either in the skin or inside the body, and that stimulates a sensory neuron. And the sensory neuron brings that information into the central nervous system. From there, the central nervous system can interpret and become aware of what that sensation is. Since these sensory neurons are bringing information into the central nervous system, we say that these fibers are afferent nerve fibers or afferent neurons. As the central nervous system interprets what's going on, it will start to generate a response that the somatomotor nervous system can carry out. The somatomotor nervous system is associated with the voluntary control of body movements by skeletal muscles. It consists of efferent nerves or motor nerves. So here we see the central nervous system sending information to an effector, and in the case of the somatomotor nervous system, the effector will always be a skeletal muscle. So this here is a multipolar neuron, because we know that multipolar neurons are motor, usually. And this one up here is a unipolar neuron, because most sensory neurons are unipolar neurons. And because this neuron is carrying information away from the central nervous system and to the effector, we say that these are efferent fibers or efferent neurons. So let's take a look at the somatosensory nervous system, or sometimes it's just called somatic sensory nervous system. This nervous system begins at receptors. Now, receptors are either specialized cells or they're even the ends of dendrites on some neurons. And so these receptors are going to detect a change. That change could be a touch or pain or temperature changes or vibration or a tickle, but they're picking up some type of change. These receptors are going to be in the skin, or they're going to be somewhere inside your body, like in visceral organs. They can also be in muscle, and they can also be in joints. So these receptors are detecting a change, and they are going to send that information through that neuron into the spinal cord. These neurons are in a peripheral nerve, and then they move into the spinal nerve, and then they move into the spinal cord. All spinal nerves contain these sensory receptors. Some of the cranial nerves also contain these same sensory neurons. These cranial nerves will also bring sensory information into the thalamus. Once the sensory neuron enters the spinal cord, it will synapse on another sensory neuron that will ascend to the thalamus. In the thalamus, that neuron will synapse onto another sensory neuron and carry that information somewhere in the cortex of the cerebrum. This ascending pathway is called a sensory pathway. Let's think about everything that has to happen here. First, the receptors have to become activated, and then they depolarize. Once they depolarize, they will generate an action potential in the sensory neuron. Then that sensory neuron will propagate that action potential into the spinal cord. Once in the spinal cord, another action potential must be generated on the neuron that will ascend through the spinal cord. Then that action potential will have to propagate down the axon of that sensory neuron. And once in the thalamus, that neuron will synapse onto another neuron, and another action potential will have to be generated. Then that action potential will propagate through that neuron, and then finally, that sensory neuron will synapse onto a neuron in the cerebrum. So that's a lot of action potentials being generated, and that's a lot of action potentials being propagated. Most of the time, actually 99% of the time, that area in the cerebrum that last neuron goes to will be somewhere in the hypothalamus or in some of the other areas in the brain that will be able to coordinate an involuntary response. In this diagram, I'm showing that last sensory neuron will synapse in the primary somatosensory cortex. So the primary somatosensory cortex is going to receive only 1% of arriving sensations. So not many of the sensations that you're feeling are going to arrive at this area. Most of the sensations you're never aware of. If it does arrive at the somatosensory cortex, then you will be aware of it. And then this somatosensory area, and do you remember what that gyrus is called? We called that the primary somatosensory cortex. It's in the post-central gyrus. That will then relay information to a primary motor cortex where a response can be generated. So when your receptors are detecting a change, we call that a sensation, right? We call it a sensation. And then that sensation has to go somewhere in your primary cortex. And if it goes up to the primary somatosensory cortex, then we become aware of it, and then we call it a perception because now you can perceive that sensation. So now let's look at the somatomotor pathway. A somatomotor pathway is your voluntary motor pathway. The effectors are skeletal muscles. Okay, so this is going to originate in the primary motor cortex. And if you remember where the primary motor cortex is, it is in that post-central gyrus right behind the central sulcus. And so sometimes we call this the pyramidal system. And the reason we call it pyramidal is because the neurons that are in the primary motor cortex look like little pyramids. So thus we call it the pyramidal system. So here we can see a motor neuron that originates in that primary motor cortex, and it's going to send a command out to the skeletal muscles. So that neuron will exit that primary motor cortex, and its axon will travel down somewhere within the spinal cord, and it will synapse onto another motor neuron, and then this motor neuron will exit the central nervous system and will synapse on a skeletal muscle. So when an action potential is generated and propagated through this neuron, that skeletal muscle will then contract. So with the somatic motor nervous system, it begins in the primary motor cortex and it ends on an effector, which is a skeletal muscle. So now what we're going to do is go back to the somatic sensory nervous system, and we're going to look at those receptors. And so for the rest of this chapter, we're going to focus on those receptors. Now remember, those receptors are specialized cells, or they're the dendrites, the endings of the neurons. So these receptors can be classified in two different ways. It can either be classified by location, or it can be classified by function, or in other words, what modality are they carrying? What sensation are they carrying? So we'll look at location. So the first type is an interoceptor. An interoceptor is a receptor that is somewhere inside the body, so somewhere inside the viscera. And viscera are organs. So the stomach, the intestines, anywhere in the digestive tract, the urinary tract, the reproductive tract, These are all interoceptors. Then we have exteroceptors, and exteroceptors are going to be found on the skin or in skeletal muscle. And proprioceptors are mostly found in joints. If we look at how we classify these receptors by function, we'll talk about nociceptors that carry pain sensations, thermoreceptors that carry information about temperature changes, chemoreceptors that carry information about oxygen or carbon dioxide levels or the pH. And then we talk about mechanoreceptors that can either be tactile receptors, baroreceptors, or proprioreceptors. Let's go ahead and look at these classifications by function a little more closely. We'll start by looking at nociceptors. Nociceptors are pain receptors. They can be found in the skin, in joints, in bones, and in blood vessels. They're sensitive to any type of mechanical damage. So if you cut through your skin or through your blood vessels, if you break a bone, that will stimulate one of these nociceptors. Other things that will stimulate these nociceptors are extreme temperatures. So you know if you are too cold, if your fingertips get too cold, you actually start to feel pain. Also, dissolved chemicals. We know that dissolved chemicals can stimulate pain receptors as well. If you have a very strong stimulus, it will excite all three of these nociceptor types. Thermoreceptors then detect temperature changes. Most thermoreceptors are free nerve endings, so they are the dendrites at the end of these neurons. Cold receptors are going to be more frequent than warm receptors. So we have more cold receptors than we do warm receptors, actually by 3 to 4 times. Temperature and pain sensations are going to be carried along the same somatosensory pathways. This temperature sensory information will first get sent to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus, it will get sent to the primary sensory cortex. And then you become aware of it. Mechanoreceptors are receptors that are sensitive to stimuli that distort their cell membranes. For example, if you press on your skin, you're distorting the cell membrane of these receptors, and then they will become activated and respond to that stimulus. There's 3 different classes of mechanoreceptors that we're going to talk about each one of them. The first class are tactile receptors. The second class are baroreceptors. And the third class are proprioreceptors. So we're going to take a look at each one of these, and then we're going to move on to chemoreceptors. Let's start with tactile receptors. Tactile receptors detect touch. And there's 2 different types of touch that they detect. They can detect fine touch and pressure, or they can detect crude touch and pressure. Fine touch and pressure receptors provide more detailed information. For example, they can determine information about the source of the stimulation, including things like its exact location. Where did it come from? Where on your body precisely did it come from? Or the shape of the object that was touching your skin, or the size of the object that was touching your skin, or maybe the texture of the object, or even is that object moving across your skin? Crude touch and pressure receptors are not detailed. They actually provide poor localization. It's much harder to tell exactly where that stimulus came from. And they give very little information about the stimulus. Baroreceptors are going to detect pressure. They monitor changes in pressure in blood vessels and in your tracts inside your body, like passageways within your body. So here's some of those passageways that I was talking about. In specific blood vessels, like in your carotid arteries that are in your neck, there are baroreceptors that can detect the amount of pressure against those blood vessel walls. Those blood vessels are bringing blood into your brain, and you shouldn't have a lot of pressure or too much pressure in those arteries going into the blood vessels in your brain. Also, in this major blood vessel called the aorta, there's also an area called the aortic sinus. That is the blood vessel that's carrying the blood directly out of your heart. And so the pressure there needs to be normal as well. There are also baroreceptors in the pulmonary blood vessels leading to your lungs, and they're detecting the pressure in those blood vessels. There's also baroreceptors in the digestive tract. So in your stomach and in your small intestine, there are receptors detecting if there's food in the small intestine or in the stomach. There's also receptors in the colon and in the rectum. In the rectum, it's detecting if there's any fecal matter in the rectum so that you should have a bowel movement. In the colon, the baroreceptors are detecting the presence of feces, and if there is feces in there, a large peristaltic contraction will carry that feces towards the rectum. There are also baroreceptors in the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder stores urine. So when the urinary bladder is full of urine, the baroreceptors are triggered, and that tells your brain that it's time for you to go urinate. Proprioceptors are the last type of mechanoreceptors that we want to talk about. Now, if you remember, we said that proprioceptors could be a way to classify by location, meaning they're going to be in the joints and even in skeletal muscle. But we can also use proprioceptors as a classification for function, right? So that's what I'm talking about right now is proprioceptors, classifying them by function. So proprioceptors monitor the positions of joints, they're also monitoring the tension in your tendons and ligaments. And they're also monitoring how much muscular contraction is going on in your muscles. So basically, it gives you a sense of body position. So even if your eyes are closed, you know what position you're in. You know if you are sitting or standing or laying down. And that's because of the result of this information from these receptors. We name some of these proprioceptors as muscle spindles, So muscle spindles are in your muscles and they're detecting the stretch that's going on in your muscle at the moment. And in tendons, those receptors are called Golgi tendon organs. Now remember, tendons attach the muscles to the bone. They're also found in receptors in the inner ear. So those receptors in the inner ear can send a continuous information to your brain, to your central nervous system, letting your brain know what position your head is in. So lastly, we're going to talk about chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors are going to detect changes in carbon dioxide, in oxygen, and pH. Peripheral chemoreceptors are found in the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies. The aortic bodies are going to detect changes in the oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in your blood, but not pH. But the carotid body will detect all three, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH. The central chemoreceptors are found in the medulla. These central chemoreceptors are most sensitive to the changes in the amount of carbon dioxide in the arterial blood and the pH of the cerebrospinal fluid. The pH of the cerebrospinal fluid is directly related to the amount of carbon dioxide in the arterial blood. Okay, this ends our lecture on Chapter 15.